I felt the muscles in my jaw lock so hard I thought a tooth might crack. My granddaughter was 3 feet away from me, frosting still clinging to her left eyebrow, a smear of buttercream sliding down the bridge of her nose like a tear that forgot which color to be. She was 5 years old. She had spent 2 weeks practicing how to blow out the candles. And the man who had just shoved her face into her own birthday cake was laughing. My daughter, Mira, stood frozen with her hand half raised, like she'd been about to catch something and forgot what falling looked like. My son-in-law's father, the man who'd done it, was wiping his palm on a linen napkin like he'd touched something unclean. And my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, the man who had stood at an altar 2 years ago and promised to protect her, was chuckling. Actually chuckling. He clapped his father on the shoulder and said, "Easy, Pop. She's got to learn the family doesn't tolerate showboating." Showboating. That was the word he used. About a 5-year-old's birthday cake. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am 63 years old. I have been to 2 wars, buried a wife, raised a daughter on my own, and seen more ugly things in boardrooms than most men see in a lifetime of bar fights. I do not lose my temper. I learned a long time ago that a man who can keep his hands still has already won most arguments before they start. But I will tell you, sitting in that dining room in Greenwich, watching frosting drip off my granddaughter's chin, I felt something unhook inside my chest that I hadn't felt since 1986, and I knew, in the quiet way you know things at my age, that the next 48 hours were going to be the most expensive 48 hours of someone else's life. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for the story, but my daughter calls me Pop, and my granddaughter calls me Pop Pop, and that's about all the title I've needed for the last decade. I run a company, or rather, I sit on the board of a company I used to run, and through that company, I quietly own pieces of about 24 others. I don't talk about it. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup with a cracked taillight. I wear flannel shirts I bought at a feed store in 1998. The first time my daughter brought my son-in-law home to meet me, I was fixing the gutter on my house in a t-shirt with a paint stain on the collar, and the kid shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. His name was Bram. Bram Vexley. The Vexleys are old Connecticut money, the kind that thinks it's older than it is, the kind that bought a coat of arms from a catalog in the 1970s. The father, my granddaughter's other grandfather, was a man named Crispin Vexley. Crispin had inherited a small chain of marinas from his own father, and had spent 40 years convincing people, mostly himself, that owning boats made him important. The first time I met Crispin was at a steakhouse in Midtown 3 years ago. Mira had just gotten engaged. Crispin shook my hand and asked, in that voice rich men use when they're trying to sound generous, "And what is it you do, friend?" I told him I was retired. He nodded the way you nod at a child who tells you about a dream they had. Then he ordered the wine without asking the rest of us, and he made sure to tell the waiter, twice, that the bottle was $400. I should have known then. I think I did know then. But Mira was glowing. She'd lost her mother at 14 and had built a life for herself in spite of everything. Finished her degree, started a small interior design firm out of a converted carriage house in Hudson, and she was looking at this Brown Vexley like he was the first person who'd ever really seen her, so I kept my mouth shut. I told myself rich families have rich manners, and I just didn't speak the dialect. 2.5 years and 1 baby later, here we were. The birthday party had been Mira's idea. Crispin had insisted on hosting at the Greenwich house, since the child's grandparents on her father's side had not yet had the privilege of throwing her a proper party. Those were his words. In a text message my daughter showed me with a tight little laugh. Mira had told me in the parking lot of a gas station off the Merritt that things had been getting strange, that Bram was different around his father. Sharper, colder. That last week, when she'd asked him to take out the trash, he'd told her that wasn't a wife's job to demand. That was a wife's job to do quietly while her husband worked. I asked her if she wanted me to talk to him. She said no. She said she could handle it. She said she just needed me at the party so my granddaughter, my little Wren, would have one face there she trusted. Wren, that's her name. My granddaughter. 5 years old, hair the color of wheat in October, a gap between her two front teeth she's very proud of. She calls ladybugs ladybuggies and refuses to be corrected. She had picked out her own dress for the party, a green velvet thing with a sash, and she had asked her mother 3 times if Pop would be there. I drove down that morning in the truck. I parked it on the street so it wouldn't ruin the photographs in front of the house. I'm not a vain man, but I've learned to read a room. The Vexley house was the kind of house that doesn't have a doorbell. It has a chime, a staff member, a young woman in a black uniform, who clearly hadn't been told her name was supposed to be remembered, opened the door and led me to a sitting room, where about 14 people were already drinking. Crispin was holding court near the fireplace, telling a story about a yacht race. His wife, my daughter's mother-in-law, a woman named Adela, was in the corner pretending to listen to one of her sisters. Mira was in the kitchen with Ren, kneeling down, fixing the sash on the green dress. Bram came over and shook my hand. His grip was harder than it needed to be. "Pop," he said, and the word came out wrong, like he was testing whether I'd notice. "Glad you could make it. Dad's been looking forward to seeing you." Behind him, Crispin glanced over his shoulder, saw me, and gave me a little salute with 2 fingers. The kind of gesture you give a doorman. I sat. I drank water. I watched. Here's what I noticed in the first hour. Crispin made 3 jokes about my truck. Bram made 2 jokes about my daughter's design business, calling it her little hobby. Adela, in the kitchen, asked Mira whether she was still doing that drawing thing or had she found something more steady. A man I didn't know, some cousin or business partner, asked me what I'd done before I retired, and when I said I'd worked in logistics, he made a face like I'd told him I'd cleaned porta potties at a county fair. Mira caught my eye twice. Both times she gave me the small, tight smile she'd been giving me since she was 12. The smile that means I'm fine. Please don't make it worse. So I didn't make it worse. Lunch was at 1. The dining room was the size of a small chapel, with a table that could have seated 20 and was set for 16. Ren was placed at the far end, between her father and her grandfather Crispin, with my daughter across from her and me 3 seats down on the same side. Ren waved at me when she sat down. I waved back. Crispin saw the wave and rolled his eyes at his wife. The cake came out at the end. It was a small thing, just for Ren. With 5 candles and a frosting unicorn on top that Mira had made herself the night before. I know because she'd sent me a picture. She'd been so proud of the unicorn. The horn was a little crooked, but she'd written underneath the photo, "I think Ren's gonna lose her mind." The cake was set in front of Ren. Everyone sang. Ren took a deep breath. The kind of deep breath only a 5-year-old can take, where her whole body inflates, and she blew out the candles. The room clapped politely, and then Crispin Vexley said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Honey, before you cut into it, why don't you tell everyone about your mommy's little baking adventure? Did she tell you the unicorn's horn is crooked? She did that herself, you know. Showing off." Ren looked confused. She looked at her mother. Mira said gently, "It's fine, Ren. Make a wish." Crispin chuckled, the way men like him chuckle, the sound of a small dog with a big collar. "Make a wish for a steadier hand, sweetheart. That's what your mom needs." Mira's face went still. I could feel it building in the room. You learn, after enough years, to feel the barometric pressure of a moment. Bram was smiling at his father. The smile of a son who has been waiting all afternoon for his father to confirm that his wife was exactly the disappointment he'd been hinting she was. Adela was looking at her wine glass like it was a hymnal. The cousins were silent. Ren had picked up the little plastic knife Mira had given her, the one with the safety edge, and was looking around the table to figure out what she'd done wrong. I should have stood up then. I know that now, but I have spent 40 years learning that you do not move until you are certain of the move, so I waited, hands flat on the tablecloth, and I watched. Mira leaned across the table to her daughter. "Sweetheart, the unicorn's perfect. Cut where you want." Crispin took a sip of wine, set the glass down, picked it up again. And then he stood, leaned across his granddaughter, and pushed the entire face of the cake into the back of Ren's head. I want to be precise about what happened, because at the time it felt like it took 10 minutes, and in reality it took about 4 seconds. Ren had been leaning forward to cut. Crispin's hand came across the table, palm flat, and he shoved the unicorn cake forward and down. The cake hit the back of Ren's head. Her face went into the plate. Frosting splattered across her green dress, across the tablecloth, across her mother's face on the other side of the table. Ren made a small noise, not a cry, just a confused little sound. The sound of a child who hasn't yet figured out whether this is a game. Crispin laughed. He turned to the table. He said, "Now, that's how you teach a kid not to take herself too seriously. My father did that to me on my 6th birthday and I turned out fine." Bram laughed with him. Actually laughed. Then he reached over, ruffled his daughter's frosting-coated hair, and said, "Thanks, Pop. Maybe that'll teach her not to be so dramatic about everything. She gets that from her mother." The room went quiet in waves. The cousins first, then Adela, then a woman near the window who I think was a neighbor. Mira hadn't moved. She was staring at her daughter, frosting on her own cheek, and I could see her hands shaking under the edge of the table. Ren lifted her head from the plate. She had cake in both eyebrows. She had her mother's crooked unicorn horn stuck to her cheek. She looked at her grandfather, the one who'd just shoved her, and then she looked at me. That look. I will remember that look until they put me in the ground. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a tantrum. It was the look of a 5-year-old trying to understand whether the world she'd believed in that morning was the actual world or not. She was checking with me. She was looking at her pop-pop to find out whether what had just happened was the kind of thing that happened. I took my napkin off my lap. I folded it once. I set it next to my plate. I stood up. I want you to understand, I did not raise my voice. I have learned that when a man in his 60s raises his voice, he sounds like a man losing control. When a man in his 60s speaks quietly, the room learns to lean in. So I spoke quietly. I said, "Ren, sweetheart, come here." She slid off her chair like the chair had caught fire. She ran the length of the table in her green velvet dress, frosting flying off her hair, and she launched into my legs and grabbed onto my belt loop, and she did not cry. She just held on. I put one hand on her head. I felt the cake in her hair. I said, "Mira, please get her a clean towel from the kitchen and meet me by the front door." Mira stood up. She was crying without knowing she was crying. She nodded. Crispin said, "Oh, come on. Don't be a stick in the mud." It was a joke. "The kid's fine. Look at her. She's not even crying." Bram said, "Pop, sit down. You're embarrassing my wife." I looked at my son-in-law. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he stopped smiling. I said, "Bram, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you just thank your father for assaulting my granddaughter?" He laughed. It was not a confident laugh. He said, "Assault? Jesus, it was a piece of cake, you people. You people. You people. You. I am going to tell you now what I did not tell my daughter at that moment. Because she was holding her child and trying to wipe frosting out of a 5-year-old's eyelashes. And she did not need a lecture on family business. But I want you, the person hearing this, to understand the architecture of what happened next. Crispin Bexley owned 3 marinas. They were in Westport, Mystic, and Newport. They were called Vexley Yacht Group, and the name was on a brass sign at each entrance. What Crispin did not know, and what he had no reason to know, was that the actual land underneath 2 of those 3 marinas was leased from a holding company in Delaware. That holding company was wholly owned by a logistics fund based in Dover. That logistics fund had 3 principal investors, and the largest one, holding 61%, was a quiet little trust that I had set up in 1998 for my daughter's eventual benefit. My daughter did not know about it. Crispin certainly did not know about it. Crispin certainly did not know about it. The only people who knew about it were me, my lawyer, and a CPA in Stamford who I trusted because I'd known his father. What Crispin also did not know was that Vex the Yacht Group had a 30-year ground lease that came up for renewal in 14 months. He had assumed, like men of his class assumed, that the renewal was a formality. He had been planning, my daughter told me last Christmas, to expand the Newport location, and he'd already taken out a personal loan against the equity in the existing marinas to fund the expansion. I knew all of this because I'd had my CPA pull the records 9 months ago, the first time my daughter had mentioned that Bram had said something cruel to her at a Sunday dinner. I am not a vengeful man, but I am a thorough one. When my daughter started flinching, I started reading. So when Crispin said, "You people," and Bram laughed at his daughter wearing his mother-in-law's hand-painted unicorn in her hair, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I had known for 9 months. I just hadn't known the day. Today was the day. I bent down. I picked Wren up. She was getting too big for that, but she put her arms around my neck and her sticky face against my collar, and I carried her out of that dining room without saying another word to Crispin Vexley or his son. Mira followed with the towel. In the foyer, I knelt and I cleaned my granddaughter's face with the towel. I cleaned her eyebrows and her chin and the unicorn horn off her cheek, and I put it carefully in my shirt pocket because I knew Mira had made it. And I knew, even at 5, Wren would want to remember that her mother had made her something beautiful before all of this. I said to Mira very quietly, "Pack your bag. Pack Wren's bag. Get in my truck. We're going to Hudson." She said, "Pop, I can't just." I said, "Mira, pack the bag." She did. Bram came into the foyer about 90 seconds later. He had his hands on his hips. He was using the voice he had clearly been practicing, the voice of a man who has watched too many movies about patriarchs. He said, "If you walk out of this house with my wife and my daughter, we are going to have a very serious problem, you and I." I looked at him. I have been looked at by men with guns. I have been looked at by men who could end a career with a phone call. I have learned what a real threat looks like, and Bram Vexley, in his $300 sweater, was not one. I said, "Bram, you are correct. We are going to have a very serious problem. Yours starts in about 45 minutes. I'd suggest you call your father's accountant before you call your lawyer." He blinked at me. I don't think he understood the words. I think he understood the tone, though, because his face did the thing rich men's faces do when they realize, for the first time, that they may have miscalculated. The little muscle under the left eye. The slight shift in the shoulders. I picked up Wren's overnight bag. I held the door for my daughter. We walked down the front steps, and I put Wren in the back seat of my pickup truck, and I buckled her in myself, because Mira's hands were still shaking too hard to work the latch. I shut the door. I walked around to the driver's side. I took my phone out of my pocket. I called my lawyer. His name is Sam. He has been my lawyer for 31 years, and the only thing I have ever asked of him on a Sunday is that he answer his phone. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Sam, it's me. I need you to do 3 things. Are you near a computer?" He said, "Give me 10 seconds. I waited. Wren was eating a granola bar her mother had pulled from the diaper bag. She looked at me through the back window. I gave her a thumbs up. She gave me one back. There was still a little bit of frosting in her ear. Sam came back on the line. He said, "Go." I said, "First, the Delaware Holding Company. I want you to send a notice of non-renewal to Vexley Yacht Group on the Westport and Mystic ground leases, effective at the end of the current term. I want it sent today, certified, with a courier. I want it on Crispin Vexley's desk before the close of business tomorrow." Sam said, "Done. What else?" I said, "Second, the personal loan Crispin took out in March. It was issued by Hartwell Trust. Hartwell Trust is a subsidiary of one of the funds I sit on the board of. I want a quiet review initiated of the collateral valuation. The marinas are worth what they're worth with a lease. They're worth considerably less without one. I want Hartwell to know by Tuesday morning that the collateral has materially changed." Sam said, "That's going to call the loan." I said, "I know." He said, "What's the third thing?" I said, "My granddaughter. She's 5. Her grandfather, Crispin Vexley, just shoved her face into her own birthday cake in front of 14 witnesses. Her father laughed and thanked him for it. I want a family law attorney in my house in Hudson by tomorrow morning, the best one in the Hudson Valley, and if she's not in the Hudson Valley, fly her in. Mira is going to need options, and I want every option on the table by lunch. Sam was quiet for a beat, then he said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I will be." He said, "I'll have someone there at 9. I hung up. I got in the truck. Mira was looking at me from the passenger seat. She said in a small voice, "Pop, what did you just do?" I said, "I just made one phone call, sweetheart. We'll talk about it when we get home." She started crying then. Not the silent kind from the dining room. The real kind. The kind I hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. I let her cry. I drove. Wren fell asleep in the back seat, about 20 minutes outside of New Haven, with frosting still in her hair. I will not bore you with the legal mechanics of the next 6 months, because legal mechanics are boring, and the only people who enjoy them are people like Sam, who bill by the hour, but I will tell you the broad strokes, because I think you've earned them. The ground lease non-renewal hit Crispin's desk on Monday afternoon. He spent the next 48 hours, my CPA later told me, trying to figure out who owned the holding company. He got as far as Delaware before the trail went legally cold, because a properly structured trust does not leave breadcrumbs for angry men. The collateral review hit Hartwell Trust on Tuesday morning. Hartwell, being a trust company that does not enjoy lending against assets that are about to lose their leases, did exactly what trust companies do. They called the loan. Crispin had 90 days to repay $1.8 million, or they would be moving against the personal residence in Greenwich, which had been pledged as secondary collateral. He did not have $1.8 million in cash. Men like Crispin rarely do. Their wealth lives in the marinas and the boats and the houses and the membership at the club. It does not live in the checking account. He tried to refinance. No one would touch him. Word travels fast in the small world of New England trust banking. By the time he picked up the phone, 3 other lenders had already heard that Vexley Yacht Group was about to lose 2 of its 3 locations, and lenders, like dogs, can smell fear. By March, the Westport Marina was being marketed for sale. By May, the Greenwich house was on the market. By July, Crispin Vexley had moved into a 2-bedroom condominium in Stamford that, according to the listing photos, had a view of a parking lot. Now, about my son-in-law. The family law attorney Sam sent up to Hudson was a woman named Pell. I won't tell you her last name because she's still practicing. She arrived at 9 on Monday morning, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and listened to my daughter for 2 hours without writing anything down. When Mira was finished, Pell said, "Okay, tell me everything you've never told anyone." Mira told her, "There was more than I knew. There was a lot more than I knew." There was a moment, about an hour into that second part of the conversation, when I had to get up and go out to the porch, because if I had stayed at the table, I would have driven back to Greenwich and done something that would have made me unavailable to my granddaughter for the rest of her childhood. Brahm had been doing what men like Brahm do. Slowly, methodically. The credit card she'd had since college gone for our financial health. The car in her name transferred for tax purposes. The interior design business she'd built slowly being routed through an LLC he'd set up to protect us from liability. Her phone monitored. Her friendships narrowed, the sashes on her own dresses, picked out by his mother. And the marriage itself. I will not tell you what he had said to her in private because she told me and she made me promise. And a promise to my daughter is not a thing I break for anyone, including a stranger listening to a story. But I will tell you that when she finished telling Pell put down her coffee cup and said, "We're not going to negotiate. We're going to file Wednesday." They filed Wednesday. Bram was, to his credit, exactly as stupid as I had assumed. He responded by hiring a Greenwich attorney whose primary qualification was that he played golf with Crispin. That attorney, working from instructions issued by a father who was at that moment watching his entire net worth turn into a parking lot view, made a series of catastrophic procedural errors. The LLC he had used to absorb my daughter's business was unwound by court order. The car was returned. The credit card was reissued in her name only. The monitoring software on her phone, which Pell's tech consultant identified within 40 minutes of taking custody of the device, became Exhibit C in a hearing that I attended in person, because I wanted to see Bram's face when the judge read the spyware logs into the record. He didn't look at me, not once, but his lawyer did. His lawyer looked at me halfway through the hearing the way men look at other men when they realize the room has been rearranged around them and no one told them. The divorce was finalized 11 months after the birthday party. My daughter received primary custody of Wren, the marital assets. What little of them had not been borrowed against by Crispin's failing marina business were split in a manner that the judge, in chambers, called appropriately corrective. Bram has supervised visitation every other Saturday at a facility in White Plains. He has not shoved a cake into anyone's face since. Crispin Vexley, the last I heard, is selling boats on commission for a man who used to work for him. Adela left him in the spring. She moved to Sarasota. She sent my daughter a letter that I have read and that I will not share. But I will tell you this, there was an apology in it, and it was the kind of apology that cost the person writing it something real. Mira keeps the letter in a drawer. She's not yet decided what to do with it. I don't push her, she has time. Wren is 6 now. She is in 1st grade. She has a missing front tooth and a stuffed unicorn named Crooked, who sleeps on her pillow, and who is named. She will tell you very seriously after the unicorn her mommy made for her on her 5th birthday, before the bad day. She does not remember the bad day in detail. She remembers, she says, that her pop-pop carried her to the truck, and that there was frosting in her ear for a long time after. I hope that's all she ever remembers. I want to say one last thing, and then I'll stop. Because I am not a man who likes to talk this long about himself. I've read the comments on stories like this one, where people ask whether the revenge was enough. Whether the marina being sold and the divorce being granted and the Greenwich house being lost and the apology being sent are, in some cosmic accounting, sufficient. The honest answer is that I do not know, and I do not particularly care. I did not do what I did to balance a ledger. I did it because my granddaughter looked at me across a dining room table with frosting in her eyelashes, and she was checking, with her eyes, whether the world she had been promised was real. And I needed her to know, in that moment and every moment after, that it was. That somewhere in the world there was a grown-up whose entire job, for the next 80 years, if necessary, was to make sure the answer to that question was yes. The marinas were a tool. The lease was a tool. The lawyer was a tool. They were the means by which I made sure that the men who taught my granddaughter on her 5th birthday that the world is cruel would also teach her, by Tuesday, that the world is just. I did not raise my voice in that dining room. I did not need to. A man who has built his life properly does not need to raise his voice. He needs to pick up the phone. And if I have any wisdom to offer, after 63 years of trying to be a decent man in an indecent world, it is this. Be quiet about what you have. Be patient about what you build. Be slow about what you spend. And when the moment arrives, as it will arrive for every father and every grandfather who pays attention, be ready. Wren is upstairs right now. She is supposed to be reading. She is, I suspect, drawing unicorns. Mira is in the kitchen, on a phone call with a client about a kitchen remodel in Rhinebeck. The interior design business is doing better than it has ever done. She hired her first employee last month. I am sitting on the porch. The truck still has the cracked taillight. I keep meaning to fix it. I probably won't. The sun is going down over the river. The air smells like late October. And somewhere in Stamford, in a 2-bedroom condominium with a view of a parking lot, a man is eating dinner alone. That is enough. For me, that is enough. Cherish the people who look at you across a table. Cherish the ones who look at you across a room. Cherish the small, sticky hands that grab your belt loop and the world tips sideways. Everything else, in the end, is just frosting. I've thought about that afternoon in Greenwich more times than I should have, and I keep coming back to one small thing. Not the cake. Not the laughter. Not even the phone call. I keep coming back to the way Wren looked at me across that table, with frosting in her eyebrows and checked. She was 5 years old, and she was already learning that the world has rules, and she needed to know whether the rule that just played out in front of her was the real one. That look has shaped how I think about almost everything since. I believe, after 63 years of paying attention, that life keeps a very honest ledger. Not a cosmic one, not a mystical one, a practical one. Crispin Vexley spent 40 years building a life on the assumption that volume was the same as authority, that money was the same as character, that contempt for working people was a sign of having arrived. He built that life out of borrowed wood, and when the wind came, the wind that comes for everyone eventually, the house fell down because the foundation had never been real to begin with. That isn't fate. That's arithmetic. You build with cheap material. You get a cheap building. Bram learned the same lesson from his father, and he passed his test the same way his father did, by failing it. He thought cruelty was strength. He thought a wife was a possession. He thought laughing at his own daughter would prove something to the man across the table. What it proved in the end was that he had nothing of his own to stand on. When the marriage came apart, there was no there, just a sweater and a borrowed name. I want to tell you what I tried to teach my daughter Mira in the months after, sitting on the porch with coffee while Wren drew unicorns at the kitchen table. I told her that being decent is not the same as being soft, that patience is not the same as permission, that a person who keeps their hands still and their head clear and their accounts in order will, in the long run, outlast almost any loud man in any loud room. I told her that nobody gets to decide your worth except you, and the moment you let someone else hold that pen, you have already lost the most important argument of your life. I also told her, and I will tell you, that strength is not the absence of fear. It is the steady decision, made one morning at a time, to build something a child can stand on. A career. A home. A name that means what it says. A life that does not require you to apologize for the space you take up. Wren is 6 now. She does not yet know what I did. Someday she will, and when she does, I hope she understands that I did not pick up that phone for revenge. I picked it up because a small person had looked at me across a table and asked with her eyes whether the world was the kind of place she had been promised. And the only honest answer I had, at 63 years old, was to make sure that it was. That is the only ledger I care about now.